Time now for the press review with Solange Mougin. Good to see you, Solange.
Hi, Delano.
You're starting off with a look at the British papers and a military dispute with Russia off the coast of Crimea.
Yeah, you won't stop our ships. That is the message that is scrawled today across the London Times. And the paper says that Britain will remain defiant in continuing to sail off the coast of Crimea, this despite, and it is in quotations, it's important to note, it's in quotations on its front page, warning shots. Now, the Daily Mail has an exclusive from the incident. One of the reporters was on board the HMS Defender, and the paper says that he heard cannon shots ring out, but the UK Defence Ministry has denied that those were warning shots from Russia, or that warplanes dropped bombs nearby, as had been claimed. But they did say that the Russian military did harass the ship. Now, for Russia, we can see from their perspective on the site of Russia Today, the whole row occurred, they say, because the British destroyer violated Russia's border in the Black Sea.
And The Guardian is analysing the situation as well.
Yeah, the paper explains that ships in general are allowed, quote-unquote, innocent passage in territorial waters, and that Britain and Russia actually routinely test each other's defenses and might. But it notes that the British military's becoming increasingly close to Ukraine's forces, and that, among other things, may be escalating things. Now, in another analysis piece, The Guardian explains that such territorial reach, or this showing of might, may be addressed to Moscow as much as it is to Beijing, as the aircraft carrier Queen Elizabeth, another ship, will take part in a multinational fleet in the South China Sea later this summer.
And Russia is also being discussed in today's Financial Times, isn't it?
Yeah, the Financial Times says that Berlin and Paris are hoping to hit the reset button on their relationship with Moscow. Now, this comes on the heels of the Biden summit and on the heels of rising tensions, as we saw with the UK. And so another Merkel, Macron, and Putin summit may soon materialize. But calls for a new strategy has some EU nations, notably the Baltic nations and Poland, quite worried. And the FT says that when such proposals were broached, quote, it wrong-footed a number of ambassadors.
Now, European ambassadors are being profiled and Politico today, aren't they?
Yeah, Politico explains that last year, when EU leaders were only speaking online, ambassadors were actually sitting down together in what the site calls, quote, the engine room that kept the EU running through the pandemic, end quote. And the site says officials are now wondering whether such extra ambassadorial power will stick around, and that in their retaining some influence, it would follow a current trend, Politico says, in the EU, or that there's a move for less power in the hands of the European Commission and more power in direct negotiations between EU member governments.
Wow. And turning over to some coronavirus news next, and there's the discovery of some hidden files.
Yeah, like the Washington Post, the site Live Science tells us that a Seattle researcher has managed to dig up from Google Cloud over a dozen partial gene sequences of some of the earliest cases of COVID-19. They had actually been erased. And the site says that these rediscovered data do not, it's important to note here, they do not support or deny any of the theories that are currently going around about how the virus originated. But the cases do confirm that the coronavirus was circulating a lot earlier than many have claimed. Now, there have also been some rather zany discoveries about COVID of late. Slate tells us that researchers have found the coronavirus attaches itself to pollen particles, and it does this pretty well. And together, those particles, they can spread actually quite far distances, surprisingly far distances. And adding to this is the fact that pollen makes people sneeze. So when they've inhaled the pollen. So if they are sick, that person's own COVID particles, well, they'll meld with the contaminated pollen particles, right? And so this would add to a concentration of COVID, thus increasing the risk of infection. And there's one more kind of sad news on top of that. Pollen reduces can reduce a person's immune defenses. So the site says that right now with the Delta variant, it may be best to sort of avoid high pollen areas.
Which is good. I'm glad it's winter in Paris again, so
Yeah.
it's probably a good thing. We don't have pollen anymore. To the U.S. next, where the press is, of course, discussing Britney Spears' testimony to a judge.
Yeah, and on its cover, on its coverage of Spears' request to no longer be under the conservatorship of her father, the New York Post pays tribute to one of her songs, adding the word "not" with its headline, "I am not a slave for you," saying she's not allowed to see her friends, get married, have another child, or even play where and when she wants. Her rather disturbing testimony reveals, the paper says, quote, the horror film that is her life.
And finally, the French papers, of course, talking about, what are they talking about? Football.
Yes, of course. After France's tie last night against Portugal in Budapest, there is much joy in the French press. It is, as the Parisien calls it, mission accomplie, mission accomplished, because the French team has gone on to the next round and will play Switzerland in Bucharest on Monday. Now, already in Bucharest, according to Le Figaro, there are half a dozen French supporters who actually thought they were there for last night's match, but actually found out upon arriving in the Romanian capital that they'd gotten their geography wrong and should have been in the Hungarian capital. Luckily, of course, France qualified for the top spot in its group last night, so Les Bleus, they will be heading to Bucharest, much to the joy of the fans, who say that they're going to stick around for the next match.
Fantastic stuff. Thank you very much for that, Solange Mougin there with the press review.